For courses exploring the foundation of modern philosophy, as well as live events bringing philosophy to life, visit Philosophy Portal online and become a member today. Throughout 2024, our members get access to 4 monthly events. In January, we focus on the concept of libido and welcome guests Layman Pascal, Alenka Zupancic, and Elliot Rosenstock. Find out more at philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm really excited today to talk to Dr. Russell Sbriglia. Dr. Russell Sbriglia is an associate professor and a director of the undergraduate literature studies at Seton Hall University. His teaching and research has focused on American literature of the long 19th century, as well as literary and critical theory. He is also the editor of books, including one book we're going to be talking about today, Subject Lessons, from the year 2020. In Subject Lessons, the main focus here is focusing on responding to an ongoing objectal turn in contemporary humanities and social sciences. The essays in Subject Lessons present a sustained case for the continued importance, indeed the indispensability, of the category of the subject for the future of materialist thought. And this book was edited along with Slavoj Žižek and contains contributions from, among others, Mladen Dollar, Alenka Zupancic, Adrian Johnston, Todd McGowan, and many others. All right, so great to have you here, Russell. And maybe just to start off, let's just get a sort of background on how you stumbled into this field. What really motivated you, and then maybe a little bit about how Subject Lessons started to come together.
Well, first of all, Cadell, thanks for inviting me to be on. It's an honor. So my background is in, as you said, I'm in an English department. My primary field of study is 19th century American literature, sort of long 19th century. I go a little bit earlier, sort of like late 18th up through, first decade or so of the 20th century. My research is mostly focused in the period known, sort of has a few different names. It means really the antebellum period of American literature, but it goes by American Renaissance, sometimes American Romanticism. And so my actual graduate work was actually a little bit closer to, not a little bit closer to, it was more grounded in political philosophy. So I was working on my dissertation was actually on antebellum conservatism. And because I was interested in how conservatism in the 19th century was almost the polar opposite of what it is today. It was much more, growing out of Burke, it was much more communitarian, much less individualistic. It certainly wasn't free market or capitalist. And but about like 2/3 of the way through my graduate career, that's my dog. About 2/3 of the way through my graduate career, I had an encounter with Žižek, and that really sort of stopped me dead in my tracks. So that when I finished there's a little bit of Žižek in my actual dissertation, but not much psychoanalysis, actually, more sort of his Hegelian material. But I found that I finished, and then because the market is so bad, the job market is so bad, in between finishing the dissertation and cobbling together like visiting positions or adjuncting, the one thing that kept me motivated to keep doing research on my own, because at a certain point, you get a few campus visits or interviews and it doesn't work out, and you're like, okay, am I going to be able to do this? And so what kept me motivated to work was actually sort of doing a deep dive into psychoanalytic theory, and in particular working on the work of Zizek. And so slowly but surely, now I didn't take a seminar in it, but I did, read a bit of psychoanalytic theory in graduate school, but that was not my focus. I sort of turned to that late. And then that put me on the trajectory that I'm on now, because I started working on the field of, or in the field of, like, it's not really a field, but literature and psychoanalysis is a field. But I started to work on Zizek in literature because, there'd been a lot of work done on Zizek's work in film. I mean, philosophy kind of goes without saying, political theory, but it was like, as far as the arts were concerned, within the humanities, it was like, oh, well, he's primarily a film guy, or he talks more about film, and you could see why. I mean, he has the Pervert's Guide films, and so I was working on that for a while, and then starting to work with him. Once I saw the new materialist turn, as part of, as you said, part of this broader objectal turn, a turn toward things, toward objects, away from subjectivity or the notion of the subject. And of course, not only Zizek's work, but the work of the Ljubljana school of psychoanalysis more generally, and of course, just a Lacanian psychoanalytic and Hegelian idealist or materialist, we could talk about that maybe, orientation. The notion of subject and subjectivity is absolutely crucial. And so the more, and actually I saw that in new materialism and things like object-oriented ontology, actor network theory, speculative realism, which is since like defunct and has become object-oriented ontology, and other members of that group have branched out into different directions. That started to have a pretty palpable effect on literary studies, and in particular, the field. Well, in my field, for instance, of the mid-19th century, you could see it most so, I would say, in Melville studies. And so that kind of set me down the trajectory, because I do find that there is something, there is a resonance actually between certain elements of new materialist thought, or the ontological materialist turn, and the Lacanian or Lacano-Hegelian orientation. But that the evacuation of subjectivity, or leaving the subject behind altogether, was something that troubled me theoretically, because I don't think that that somebody like Melville or authors of the mid-19th century were actually, I think they were obsessed in a way with the problematic of subjectivity. So to evacuate the notion of subjectivity, I mean, they definitely problematize it, but to get rid of it in favor of a sort of Deleuzian deterritorialization, I didn't think necessarily was reflective of what the authors were trying to do. So I don't know, it was quite a long-winded answer, but essentially that's how I came into it. I had this like encounter like midway through graduate school with the work of Zizek, and it really ended up turning the direction of my work.
Fantastic. I mean, it's always it's always interesting to see the inroads to this field, and that sort of get the history of the personal history of the signifier, I suppose, in terms of how that started to unfold. And the first thing that jumps out at me there in your story and your history is this interest in 19th century conservatism being something that leans more in a communitarian direction than an individualist direction. And that's something that I think I've heard Zizek comment on a lot lately, of sort of saying like there's an alliance between sort of conservative communists and like communist communitarians. Like that
Yeah,
there's some interesting political intersection there. Have you had any thoughts on that?
I haven't given that a lot of thought. What happened was, I had finished my my comprehensive exams, and over the summer, there was maybe some of the viewers will be aware of this, but Cornell University every year has this school for criticism and theory, and it's a 6-week. I mean, if you're there, it's affectionately called Theory Camp, and you take a seminar with somebody for 6 weeks. And I took a seminar with this great literary critic and theorist, Simon Doering, on titled Conservatism, Religion, and History, because it seemed like the most interesting of the 4 seminars being offered. And we did like from Burke up through Michael Oakeshott. And I mean, I'm not at all a conservative, but I found things that were interesting in taking that. We didn't read any. It was all British. Actually, it was not all. I mean, it was European. We read Joseph de Maistre and stuff like that. But I saw resonances between like Nathaniel Hawthorne's critique of individualism and his pushing back against certain tenets of transcendentalism in that conservative tradition that we were looking at. And so much of Americanist literary and political theory is about the liberal tradition. And even discussions of somebody like Hawthorne, for instance, they tend to focus primarily on, like, they'll look at the Scarlet Letter and the way that the A works throughout that novel, and it doesn't have a specific meaning, and how that ties into a sort of liberal pluralism that co-ops dissent in the name of sort of multiple interpretations, pluralism. And so, but if you go back and look at a lot of those tales and even some of his novels, I mean, it's very conservative in this sort of Burkean sense. It's kind of anti-theory in a way. It's practical. But like, I know actually, recently, the past few years now, Zizek likes to say that he's what do you say, a moderately conservative communist. I should ask him. It'd be interesting for somebody to ask him exactly, like, to define exactly what he means by conservative, because I think it would be, much different than, the way the term is used, to refer to, political parties and politicians now. But there was something about, it was so foreign to me, maybe as an Americanist, when I took that seminar years ago, to speak about conservatism in such a way that was, the antithesis of, rugged individualism, laissez-faire capitalism. And so I was interested in sort of unearthing that tradition, not necessarily to uphold it, but like complicating the picture and saying, well, the mid-19th century wasn't just this sort of, liberalism hadn't been entirely established as unassailable. And, there are connections between that and my subsequent work. So, for instance, one of the chapters of my dissertation, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but was on Poe, and Poe's critique of liberal individualism really starts to get into things like, I mean, he anticipates Freud and Lacan and the notion of death drive, jouissance, unconscious. And so there were like little sort of seeds of me moving in that direction to begin with, and then I just sort of ended up going, full-fledged into that. It'd be interesting to go back to that project at some point later, but I haven't, or to even, like, in response to, to the question that you were just saying, like, to think about it with regard to, contemporary things, because, like, when I think of somebody like, there have to be better examples, but like most, the like sort of red brown alliance, or people who claim that they're conservative communist, like I don't know, like a MAGA communist or something, knows nothing really about communism, as it turns out. So but it is an interesting development.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's just an interesting inroads just in terms of the historicity of the conservative signifier, and maybe
Yeah.
there's a new perspective there that you have a real rich connection with in the sense of your literary background. And maybe that's another inroad we should cover is your literary background, because it does figure into your contribution to this edited volume, Subject Lessons. Um, in what way do you think, you already touched on it a little bit, but in what way do you think literature has been perhaps undermined, or what's at stake with reclaiming the subject as a constitutive part of literary studies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, I mean, this may be true about literature in the 19th century in general. I don't necessarily know if I want to claim something as like special or exceptional about American literature, but at least the the romantic authors that I'm interested in, it can often be difficult to say whether what they're doing. Is it literature? Is it philosophy? Is it psychology? Is it political theory? I mean, somebody like an author like Poe, for instance, um, if you look at tales of his like The Black Cat, or one of my favorites, which is it's not a great story formally or aesthetically, but and it's a short tale. I've written about it a few times. The Imp of the Perverse. Um, if you look at if you look at that tale, The Imp of the Perverse, it's about 5 pages long. The first two and a half, 3 pages, it's really just a philosophical sort of meditation, and I mean that almost in the sort of Cartesian sense. There are a few veiled references to Descartes in it, and so it's like, okay, what? And then after like page 3, it's almost like Poe realizes, oh wait, I have to give a. This is supposed to be a story. Let me sort of perfunctorily tack on a narrative at the end of it, and it is pretty perfunctorily tacked on because it's essentially the same thing that he wrote in The Telltale Heart. He just kind of like threw it together, but it's a philosophical meditation on the nature of subjectivity, and it's an examination or an analysis of the unconscious avant Lillet. I'm positive of that, or I would argue very strongly in favor of that. Melville, um, you know, Moby Dick, sure, it's a novel, but if anyone who's read it, as anyone who's read it knows, it the narrative, it's like the first 100 pages or so of the novel is just like straightforward narrative until they get on the ship. And then as soon as they get on the ship, Melville, through the narrator, Ishmael, just goes on these philosophical digressions from the question, it's a question as to whether or not they're really digressions, but for chapters on end, and anyone who's taught that book knows that the students, you always have like a couple of students who really like the philosophical asides, but most everyone is like, okay, what happened to the story? Like all of a sudden now we're talking about all the different types of whales. He's talking about, he's comparing when you have whales heads on either side of the ship to balance them. He says one is like Locke and one is like Kant. So he's contrasting like empiricism and idealism, or empiricism and rationalism. And it's so clearly, again, like a meditation on the nature of subjectivity. His novel, the novel that Melville wrote after Moby Dick, Pierre, it's all about what drives us. And I think similarly to Poe, I think Melville discovers drive before Freud does. What drives us and motivates us to act the way we do. These are philosophical, theoretical questions that are posed through. I don't want to say that, you know, that they just dressed it up like through the garb of or put the garb of fiction on it. I think that would be to discount the literariness of it. But there's something about those like that period, because Romanticism was so heavily influenced by German idealism, in addition to the great British and German romantics, that the literature can't help but be philosophical. And so for me, it's not about taking the literature and importing it into like the Kantian or Hegelian frame, or taking it and then putting it into this sort of psychoanalytic analysis machine, or because I think that it's already there in the literature, and the literature itself is already doing the work of thinking, the work of philosophizing, the work of theorizing. And so I think that's why I like the interdisciplinarity of the sort of intersection of literature, philosophy, psychoanalysis, because these fields, even as disparate as they might be and sort of siloed as they are in many ways today, the literature itself doesn't reflect that. The literature itself does not reflect that. It's deeply philosophical, explicitly engaged in asking, epistemological, ontological questions. There's a famous, and then I'll stop in a minute. I've been going on, but there's a famous letter from Melville to Hawthorne. We don't have any of Hawthorne's letters to Melville. I think he asked them to burn them, but and Melville specifically or explicitly talks about, when looking forward to when he and Hawthorne get together and drink brandy and smoke cigars, and this is a quote, and talk ontological heroics. So it's there in their own words.
I just want to sort of emphasize and re-emphasize the importance of the line of thought that you've been investigating, because I've just been teaching Lacan's Écrit, and one of the points I was making in a lesson which explicitly focuses on literature is the way in which literature is in no way peripheral to the history of psychoanalysis in terms of core theory. Because when you think about Freud and Oedipus, specifically Oedipus Rex as a myth, and then you think about the opening of the Écrit with the Purloined Letter, I mean, it's not just peripheral stuff. I mean, fundamental ways of thinking about the Oedipus complex, or fundamental ways of thinking about the L schema, are really derived and inspired by literature. So it's just right there, right? I mean, the interconnection is deep and
I mean, the story is that Freud had already he'd already been sort of had some inkling of going in the direction of like a sort of Oedipal of the Oedipus complex, and then he saw his father died, and then he saw a performance of, I mean, now maybe this is a little bit like romanticized after the fact. I don't think that you could say that it's apocryphal, but he saw a performance of Oedipus, and there's it's right there. I mean, in the interpretation of dreams, in the famous passage where he not first articulates, but I guess like first articulates it, I think, in print, and talks about it in a sustained fashion. He introduces it through literally, I mean, the story of Oedipus, and then right after that, he goes into a great short or brief reading of Hamlet, right? I mean, he says everyone thinks that the problem in Hamlet is that sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and that he's indecisive. And Freud points out, no, Hamlet's he's not indecisive. When he thinks that when he stabs Polonius, he doesn't know that it's Polonius, but when he thinks that it's probably Claudius, but he stabs him, he doesn't hesitate. And so it can only be, or the reason why he hesitates, Freud argues there famously, is because he sees in Claudius what he would like to do, which is to have his mother, right? To kill his father and to have his mother. So it's kind of like, that's why he's prevented from killing Claudius, because Claudius has already achieved what he unconsciously wants to achieve, killing his father and then sleeping with his mother. And, Lacan, as you mentioned, the écrit begins with that seminar on the Purloined Letter. Seminar 6 is devoted to, it is 6, right? A long reading of, Desire and its Interpretation. A long reading of Hamlet. Seminar 7, you get Antigone. Is 8 Claudel? But I mean, then you have the Joyce seminar on Saint-Thome, and so, and there are more examples, but the literature, like you said, it's not peripheral. I mean, it's through the literature. And of course, anyone who's read and is taught Lacan knows that, he does this with all kinds of fields and discourses, bringing this in to shape his thought. But I mean, literature, arguably more than any other sort of field, maybe other aside from like Freud, really helps shape Lacanian concepts. And so they're joined at the hip in many ways.
Absolutely. That's my impression as well. So it's I think it's super valuable to have a theorist like yourself who's I think continuing that tradition. And maybe that's a good inroad to talking about the way you frame subject lessons in the introduction. And I think to start, we should just ease into the concept of materialism and its relationship to the humanities, and specifically sort of starting with what I think you'll refer to as the first death of the subject, or the first death that accompanies sort of the primacy of materialism in the humanities, with this deconstructive term, figures like Foucault, figures like Derrida. What do you think? I mean, maybe just set the stage of what you're trying to emphasize with the, let's say, hegemony of materialism in the humanities since the 1980s and its impact on the way we think about subjectivity.
Yeah, I mean, so literary studies from the 80s, and I would say its grip has lessened quite a bit now, although it still is kind of implicitly guiding a number of inquiries and projects. But from the 80s, for about, I don't know, 25 years or so, literary studies was dominated by historicism. And in the British tradition, I'm not saying that these two are, one, that there's a one-to-one, or that they're exactly the same, but in the US, it was known as the New Historicism. In Britain, it was more sort of like cultural materialism. But they were both heavily influenced by thinkers like Foucault. And even though Foucault, is by no means a Marxist, also I think this is what makes it kind of a strange combination. Althusser actually played a big role in historicism as well. And it's, of course, the notion that subjectivity, or subjecthood, it's not something that is like internal, or something that has to do with the individual, or that someone self-defines. It has much more to do with language and discourse. And of course, Lacan is now the Ljubljana school, and Zizek's sort of contribution is to shift away from thinking of Lacan as a philosopher of language. But of course, language and signification is also important to Lacan. But for somebody like Foucault, the subjects are created; they are a byproduct, a sort of epiphenomenon of discourse, and of these different sort of socio-historical epistemes. For Althusser, and of course, again, there's a difference here. I'm not reducing Foucault to Althusser, or vice versa. Althusser is a Marxist, but the subject is, again, an effect of discourse, and, well, really an effect of these these ISAs, right? Ideological state apparatuses, and language actually plays a key role in Althusser's theory of the subject, right? Because one becomes you're an individual, and then when you're hailed or interpolated by the big other, or in Althusser's example is a policeman, right? You're walking down the street, and Althusser says, a policeman calls out, "Hey, you there!" But even if you are not the intended addressee of the officer's hail, you turn around, and in that moment, even if it's been misrecognized, that's Althusser's point, actually, right? Is that misrecognition is always already recognition, that you become a subject, and you're a subject who is then, to use a more Foucauldian term, like disciplined by these various ideological state apparatuses, or socio-symbolic matrices that through schools, church, media, that again interpolate you as a particular subject. So like a subject of late capitalism, for instance. Whereas that's a kind of version. How that gets translated into literary studies is like author studies is an interesting field here, and Foucault would be a perfect example here, because Foucault has that famous essay, which is often taught alongside Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author. Foucault has that famous essay titled "What is an author?" Or "What was an author?" And I haven't looked at it in a long time, but it's essentially the notion that authors, and I think I include this example, we include this, I think it's in the very first page of the introduction to subject lessons. An author, a literary critic would say, a historian would say, authors are not born, they're made. And they're a result of the socio-historical context in which they were born. And so authors then are created, either both, well, they're actually, authorship is created in two senses, or in at two different points. It's determined by the era in which the author is writing and the context. And then also, if it's an author from the 19th century, a new historicist or a cultural materialist would be interested in how that author becomes the genius that he or she is considered today through this historical process of canonization. And you'd look at the formation of English departments, et cetera, all these different questions. That translates to the literary text insofar as then from an historicist point of view, the text itself is it's not the work of a sole literary genius. I'm not saying that I necessarily subscribe to the sole genius theory, but that the text itself is actually a byproduct or an epiphenomenon of its context. And so when that translates into new materialism, now new materialism is pushing back actually against this, saying, well, we had cultural materialism, which really didn't pay attention to matter as such. The question from them is usually like, where was the materialism, or where was the matter in materialism? And so they're moving, the idea is to move back and look at, make materialism more about matter. And this is why a lot of new materialist thought is also ecologically conscious, or is interested in ecology and looking at systems and environment. But it does maintain, and Slavoj and I talk about this in the introduction. It nonetheless has this sort of same move, in that it's dependent upon the dissolution of this notion of a subject as like a sort of rational, free, autonomous, self-directing entity, because the new material. So, but for the new materialists, it's not so much discourse or ISAs, ideological state apparatuses, that determine the subject. It's matter itself. Matter itself is agential, they'll say, And Jane Bennett, probably the most famous new materialist, matter, like, talks about vibrant matter, and matter sort of pushing back against matter itself, exerting agency, and not just being something that is dead, that then human beings can, who are subjects, and who do have agency, can manipulate to their own will. This is why a lot of new materialist thought, again, is ecological. It's like, okay, so matter is dead, inert, and human beings are the agents, and so therefore we can do whatever we want with matter. So I don't know, maybe I was a little bit long-winded, but that's basically like how we, as far as I'm concerned, like the difference between, well, both how we got from sort of a more traditional, like, or older historicist, culturalist materialism and new materialism. I'm not saying that there's no, I think there are sort of drastic differences between them, but the death of the subject, this is the kind, that's what we talk about in the introduction. This is what you're getting at. Like, the new materialism is kind of, again, like the death of the subject redux in a way.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think that's very clear in terms of this cultural history stemming from the 1980s up until sort of the birth of new materialism. I think that for the listeners, I think perhaps we need to zero in on what these different forms of the consequences that these forms of materialism might have for our perception of what you were talking about in the subject lessons as the bourgeois monad or the ego or the individual, the way we conceive of our individual self. I think you were clearly pointing towards it when you were giving the example of Althusser and being interpolated by the big other, and the example of the ideological state apparatus and the police officer. You know, in maybe one way into this would be, what do you think is the difference between the way either the new historicists or cultural materialists view the ego or the bourgeois monad, and then what way do you think the I suppose it would be the new materialists view the same concept or the same idea?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the for the new historicist, or the sort of cultural materialist, it essentially means that the notion of the self, or the ego, well, first of all, there's a slipperiness between self or ego and subject, and this, I think, is part of where a big disagreement lies. Historicism, the new historicism was explicitly, it's funny because even though it relies upon a thinker like Foucault, it was explicitly, at least in the American context, anti-theoretical, like a turn away from theory, in which had dominated American literary studies in the 70s, whether it was Derrida and deconstruction, or Lacan's first initial introduction into the U.S. Academy through literature departments primarily, and that was, again, like, sort of Lacan as philosopher of language. But the notion of a self, let's go back to your Althusser example. New historicism and cultural materialism, I think, it's interesting because part of the impetus behind that was that Derridian deconstruction, for instance, was, a critique of it was that it was apolitical, it was too abstract, it was too divorced from material conditions. And then you look at what the typical new historicist argument is, and let's look at Althusser, there's really no form of resistance possible. So if the subject gets interpolated by ideology, and the subject is merely a byproduct of ideology, you're kind of at a dead end, because if you're just a byproduct of the system, how do you get out of the system? How do you this is, and this kind of question gets picked up by somebody like Judith Butler in a book of hers, like The Psychic Life of Power. And so there's really very little form of resistance possible. Whereas for somebody like Zizek, the notion of the subject, it's not that, how do I want to put this? It's not that ideology interpolates persons into subjects, or individuals into subjects, like it is for Althusser, and I would say for historicists. That's why historicist work in American literary studies is so focused on ideology critique, because it is all about how the subject is formed by its context. But for Zizek, it's actually like subjectivity is what what he means by subjectivity is that which resists ideological interpolation. The subject is the sort of kernel of the real that stands, that does not identify with, it disidentifies actually with the ideological hale of hey, you there. It's like, why are you? It's the Lacanian question here is the que voi. Like, why am I what you're telling me I am? What object do you see in me that tells me that I'm this? And so that's why I think psychoanalysis is so interesting, because it shifts the ground from the conscious ego, because I think that's really what's meant both in like new historicist or cultural materialist work and new materialist work, is that when they use the term subject, it's not you. It usually means like just self ego. It doesn't mean subject as a subject of the signifier, the Lacanian barred subject of the unconscious, which is not, of course, in control, but is guided by it's an extimate form of agency that has to do with the objet petit a, right? Now, for the new materialists, again, I think that, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that their notion of subject between the notion of subject changes very little between the new historicist, cultural materialist, and the new materialist notion of it. They have that in common, that neither is particularly interested in like a split subject or a subject of the unconscious. And so that is actually one of the that's one of the things that in our introduction to the subject lessons book we try to point out, is that here are the ways in which new materialist thought presents itself as a departure from this older materialism that is more interested in language, discourse, as opposed to matter itself. But really, the subject against which they're the subject that they're unraveling or undoing is actually very much the same, and neither of them touch upon the subject of the real, a psychoanalytic subject. I don't know if that answers the question or what you were trying to get at there, but I do think that there's not much differentiation between those two different types of materialism vis-a-vis what they understand as subject.
Right. I mean, I think it comes out very clearly in your text that you have this idea of the autonomous bourgeois monad, ego individual, and like you're emphasizing, I think clearly in regards to the Althusserian model, you can have sort of a framing of the emergence of that subject through the big other and the deconstruction of that subject. And then on the new materialist side, you could have sort of an alternative approach to deconstructing that subject through the positing of, for example, vibrant matter.
Right.
But like you're saying, there's no this doesn't make the distinction basically between the ego and the subject of the unconscious. And I think that
Yeah.
this distinction between the ego and the subject of the unconscious is the crucial move. And I think we need to get into that in all its detail. However, before we get into that in all its detail, I just want to sort of maybe go into a little bit about what are the consequences of these two forms of materialism that you're sort of pushing back on or resisting a little bit. Um, on the one hand, the new materialist, on the other hand, the cultural historicist. What is the consequence of deconstructing the bourgeois monad, the ego individual, without having a robust concept of the subject of the unconscious?
Yeah, well, I think I started to gravitate or to touch upon that a little bit in the notion when I was talking about the notion of like resistance almost being impossible under the new historicist. It's a great irony. There's actually a great book on Emerson by this Americanist critic, although he himself is a German scholar, Johannes Waltz, and he points out, it's called Transcendental Resistance. He points out, it's about 10 years ago, this book. He points out this sort of irony, or maybe not, maybe irony is the wrong word, the sort of paradox that is sort of hamstringing a lot of historicist, cultural materialist thought, is that thought is heavily it has a heavy activist bent to it, in that like it's reacting against deconstruction and against psychoanalysis, at least as it was introduced in the American Academy in the 70s, as again being apolitical, being too divorced from conditions on the ground, material concerns. And what ends up happening there, though, is that their actual theoretical framework, you have a tension between wanting to. I think this is why a lot of the work that was done in that regard was sort of critiquing a text for its political unconscious. The text proclaims to be radical, but actually, if you perform this sort of symptomatic reading of it, and even the notion of symptomatic reading can't help but be related to psychoanalysis in a way. You're looking for symptoms in the text that belie its surface. But you have this activist goal, but the theory actually tells you that resistance is futile, basically, because it will always be co-opted by ideology, by the interpretive power of the hegemonic ideological regime. And so I actually think that in a way, now it did have historicism did have positive new historicism did have positive consequences, in that it did expand the canon, and we do read works of literature that are that I think are quite incredible, that we wouldn't have read otherwise under the sort of old regime. But you do get stuck at some point theoretically as to how to break out of that, like how to what do you do if the subject is just a byproduct of ideology? Like how do you resist? And Zizek has talked a lot about this, the way in which resistance now is actually sort of built into, I mean, Hollywood sells us all kinds of resistance films, and yet it can just as easily sort of lull us to sleep and make us well, I don't need to the film does the resistance for us almost. Or his point about V for Vendetta, how he said, he said I'd sell my grandmother into slavery if someone could show me what happens the day after, like a V for Vendetta 2. I think that in the case of new materialism, that again, that is also, let's take the ecological strain of it. That is also very activist in orientation, because the argument is that unless we call into question, unless we critique this notion of human exceptionalism that has brought us to this ecological, or brought us to the brink of ecological catastrophe, the Anthropocene, or the Capitalocene, however we want to say it, that therefore we need to step outside of subjectivity and attend to nature itself, or to matter itself. And so, like Graham Harman's argument, now he's not a new materialist. In fact, he'll explicitly differentiate the difference between, in a number of his books, new materialism and object-oriented ontology. But it's the same notion of flattening the ontological plane so that human being is on par, or is horizontalized basically with all other forms of matter, as opposed to the hierarchy, like almost the great chain of being old model, where you've got human beings and then matter is sort of lowest. And that is, there is a lot in new materialist and even object-oriented ontology thought that I find compelling and appealing, but it also takes away from, or detracts from, again, the notion, I think that it sees resistance in moving away from the subject. Like that's the way to resist, is to step outside of human subjectivity. And from the Lacanian Hegelian position, that would truncate like the radical act, right? Zizek's thinking is all about following Lacan, an ethical act. And I think that such an act can only be based upon what Zizek calls an unconscious choice, in a way, and then remaining, holding on to, or remaining, maintaining your fidelity to that. And so I just think that if we get rid of the unconscious, we get rid of quite a bit. And so the stakes of it, I mean, it depends. I think the stakes of it, we could talk about it like politically, we could talk about it theoretically, we could talk about it philosophically. But I think what's interesting philosophically is that, and part of what I'm trying to argue is that if you go back and look at Kant and Hegel, like these figures who supposedly their philosophies, I mean, Descartes, like whose philosophy is supposed to be a philosophy of human mastery, of this, again, the autonomous, rational, self-directed subject, is kind of a retroactive fiction, or kind of presentist invention, because if you go back to Kant and Hegel, you certainly don't see that. What you get in Kant is the moral law is traumatic. It seems like a foreign, like Zizek talks about this, like a foreign intruder, like an alien sort of kernel in your being is directing you to do something. Hegel has the notion of the cunning of reason, right? And so the idea, like what's basically passed off as, the autonomous subject, actually didn't really exist in the way that it's being sort of, I think caricatured is too strong of a word, but the way in which the new materialists and object-oriented ontologists present this, supposedly grandiose subject, it's subjectivity is kind of a curse in a way in the Lacanian Hegelian. It's a burden, and it's different from the acquisitory version of what constitutes a subject in the discourse of the new materialists.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic clarification, especially in regards to your sort of final conclusion there in terms of what the philosophical stakes of this are. And it was also very clear to me the way you were describing the stakes in the new historicist move being sort of this inability to resist. You know, I'm taking coming to mind all the major forms of cultural resistances here, which are sort of taken up by the system and fed back to the people resisting. Or like I thought it was also very clear when you were describing the new materialist ecological emphasis, that there's all sorts of ways in which we can um, fail to take into consideration the relation between the subject of the unconscious in this picture. And I just on that note, the stakes of bringing the subject of the unconscious back into the picture and back into theory. Do you think that it's not being thought precisely because it is a negativity, because it is a curse and a burden, because it is painful, because it is it's something that what I'm wondering, what I'm questioning here, is can the contemporary academic institutions hold the negativity involved in bringing the subject of the unconscious to philosophical reflection? And I'm thinking about that in the context of the way in which a lot of these theories are becoming more popular online, outside of the institution. So maybe that there's sort of like the subject of the unconscious as a crack in the institution itself, or something like that. I'm not sure what you think here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a it's really interesting because I mean, psychoanalysis today occupies a very strange spot, I think, in the university system. I mean, in the United States, I mean, um, one of the only places that you can still work on psychoanalytic theory and it not be considered, completely, um, you know, treated as though it's like, I don't know, phrenology or physiognomy or some sort of pseudoscience that has been debunked by, brain and cognitive sciences, right? Like, um, a brain and cognitive scientist, this is an overgeneralization, but like, would probably have very little interest in the notion of the unconscious. Like, show me where, we'll do a brain scan and you show me where in the human mind you find the unconscious, right? It doesn't, but of course, Lacan's point that the unconscious is outside is important because it's an extimate relation. But I think that I think that the university, it's a really good question. I have to give it some thought. It is kind of a crack because it's based on it's based on attention to something that is difficult to quantify. I mean, Freud had this problem too. I mean, Freud really like desperately wanted psychoanalysis to be like a science and to be kind of a hard science in a way. And but it doesn't quite get there. And I think the notion of negativity is really interesting because especially in our current era where everything is about affirmation, like be your best self, realize your true potential, sort of stifle or suppress any sort of, not that they use the term stifle or suppress, but you know get rid of negative thoughts. I'm not saying that this is the kind of
Power of
negativity
positive
that we're talking
thinking.
about. The power of positive thinking. So like to tarry with the negative is not something that
No.
that we get advised to do. I mean, and in a way you could understand, like, who's going to stand up in the middle of a classroom and tell people to your homework for tonight is to go home and tarry with the negative and encounter the night of the world. You know, if everyone, you'll be lucky if everyone from the class comes back, you know, after that. There is something sort of illicit or kind of dangerous or threatening in that tearing with the negativity, because you're achieving, I mean, you know, so it involves subjective destitution. I mean, like that's a big concept in psychoanalytic theory, and it's related to this night of the world. And so, like you said, it hurts. It's painful. I mean, this is one of Zizek's mantras: freedom, freedom hurts. You know, who would sign up for this? You know, because it forces
happiness is a category of slaves and so forth.
Yeah, and well, that's why also, like, in that debate that Zizek did with Jordan Peterson, it was kind of ridiculous in a way that happiness was the topic, because happiness from the psychoanalytic perspective is the most, like, you know, practicing, you know, mindfulness or self-care is to make you happier, is not you know, is not the goal, or, you know, should not be the goal. But I think precisely because psychoanalysis, and then we were talking about this actually, you know, a little bit earlier, think like Hegelian negativity, you know, that's not something that most philosophers in an American context, at least, are interested in. You know, they'll leave that for, like, you know, comparative literature departments. But I think that the fact that this is, as you said, that this kind of thinking, you know, psychoanalytic theory, is picking up steam online, and among a number of sort of like non-academics and lay people who are just interested in theory for its own sake, says something about the fact that the university is not necessarily producing this. And of course, like, the modern university now is, the humanities are in, you know, a very precarious position. And the idea that you would, you know, go to college or go to a university in order to tackle these philosophical questions, it's like, no, the goal of going to a university nowadays is to become, you know, a good worker for you know, they're basically, you know, career, you know, they've been turned into vocational places. Yeah. You go here to, you get a business degree, and then you go work on Wall Street for, you know, now that's a little bit too simplistic, and of course that's not true of everybody, but the kind of space that we have for it is minimal, and I think that we need to cultivate more of that within the university. But I'm certainly glad to see that it's developing outside of the university as well, because the university itself can work, as you were you know, speaking of, like, co-optation, can often work to co-opt social movements. I think that's true with things like, and again, I'm pro I'm not anti diversity, equity, and inclusion, but a lot of, like, the DEI initiatives that are, you know, top down from administration, can often help to, you know, actually stifle co-opt that sort of what was initially a more radical or revolutionary dissent into, well, let's write it into the actual system. Are you practicing, you know, have you taken your diversity training? Are you have you worked on mitigating or lessening your implicit bias? Yeah, things like that, right?
Do you feel like you're living in a wasteland of thought? Philosophy Portal is a thinking community, a thought oasis in a wasteland of thought. Now we're launching a thinking portal, a live event space aiming to facilitate dynamic connections, creating open but contained and focused spaces to test and work with new ideas. Our live event space will feature 4 different events every month, all structured by one theme. Concept Cave to learn fundamental concepts. The Edge to meet active practitioners. Thought Lab to be inspired by core thinkers. And Real Talk, a space for personal relation to these ideas. Members not only get access to our 4 live events monthly, but also access to our private forum, receive discounts on our recorded and live courses, as well as priority access to apply for retreats. Welcome to the Thinking Portal. We hope you join us in 2024. Right. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So that seems to me to be so the what you're emphasizing there with the university system sort of stifling and co-opting sort of an initial radical revolutionary dissent seems to me to be on the side of the influence of the cultural historicist sort of angle. Do you see any negative institutional impact of what you're framing as the new materialisms or the object-oriented ontology? How does that sort of materially affect sort of institutional life or academic life or the pursuit of truth, or does it?
I actually, I think, it's a really good question. I think that let me put it this way. I think that by and large, becoming more ecologically conscious is quite a good thing. And my problem is that when it's sort of divorced from it's divorced, like when it goes so far to like the agency of matter that it ultimately gets divorced from actually like what individuals can do. And I don't mean like to interpolate in like you on the individual level. Like what if, like, again, like I'm kind of riffing on Zizek here, but you know, he's like ecological ideology. Like what have you done? Like to, you know, have you done the proper recycling? Have you you know, have you been composting and everything? As opposed to, I think that it can have a sort of, I think that is one danger, that it can, if the human subject, and like again, what they mean by subject is different, but like if it is all about like curbing you know, the acquisitory, like, you know, nature of you know, human beings in the late capitalist era, I think that it can turn into, well, what have I like, similar to, actually to diversity training, like what have I done in order to help this project along, as opposed to well, actually, you know, we're not going to combat climate change by switching all of our you know, straws from plastic to paper. What would really help is if we actually focused on, you know, the handful of billionaires or of corporations, you know, who are responsible for, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but you know, the vast majority, 90% or something of what causes pollution and why the world is kind of falling apart. So I think that there is some good work. There is some alliance in certain regards, or in certain corners, between new materialist and Marxist thought. And I think that can have a very positive impact, attending to both matter but without moving away from the actual apparatuses, you know, like corporations that are responsible for this. I think that when it comes to certain things like actor network theory, and which is part of maybe more less new materialist and more sort of this general sort of vitalist turn, that can also, and I'm not the first person to argue about this, but that can lead to a sort of quietism, focusing on systems. And Bruno Latour is famous for saying, you know, critique has run out of steam. So like getting away from critique entirely, and focusing on things like, I don't know, in literary studies, this ends up being like attending to the text itself, like surface reading, and doing like description as opposed to critique. I think that can ultimately end in a sort of political quietism. But I wouldn't want to make a sort of grandiose claim or accusation that that new materialist thought is sort of, you know, bad for the you know, the academy. I don't particularly And I think that actually its influence is starting to wane a little bit in recent years. I mean, we published the book in 2020, and it was a lead up of about 3 or 4 years putting it together. And I still think that I mean, new materialism is still very popular in a number of different areas, including literary studies. But I think it might have reached its sort of high watermark and might be sort of receding a little bit. But I could be wrong about that.
Well, my doctoral program was an interdisciplinary studies influenced by complexity science at the Free University of Brussels. And I would say the implicit metaphysics of a lot of people working at that institute was new materialist.
Yeah,
They had shifted from, it wasn't, there was some influence of cultural historicism, but mostly not interested in that. There was a big emphasis on sort of this horizontal leveling of the subject in relationship to other objects, and sort of having, a more a less anthropocentric view
yeah,
of the universe. What do you think? That's always fascinated with me, because I've always sort of had a tendency to, there's something weird. There's like my first motivation, my first impulse in, like, when I was going back to like 18, 19 years old, was like, there's something weird about the human being. There's something weird about us, like, and that sort of like
yeah,
led me for the rest of my career. I'm interested in that, whatever that weird tick is.
yeah,
And you could even say like that weird tick has something to do with object patia or something like that.
yeah.
But my major question here is, what do you think is underlying this desire to level the subject with other objects, to have a more horizontal view as opposed to a more vertical view? And I want to throw out one idea inspired by the
Yeah.
Akri, is that it has something to do with the failure of metaphor, because metaphor gives a certain verticality and metonymy is more horizontal. So I was thinking that
It's interesting.
there's some sort of metaphorical short circuit in our civilization culture, our inability to be, it's basic, it could be some issue with the name of the father or the paternal function.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe it has to do with maybe it is. I'd have to give this more thought before I before I throw a lot of weight behind this. But maybe it is related in some ways to the decline of symbolic authority, or to the sort of the failure, or the loss of efficacy of the symbolic order, or of the paternal function. Um, but it's interesting that about this sort of your point about, in your program it was about like horizontality, and but I really like your point about like there's something weird about the human being. That's what I think. So to bring it to, maybe I can draw on an example that I've written about to make this sort of more concrete. Um, let's take Jane Bennett's notion of vibrant matter, and which I actually think is really interesting. And now we know like that matter, can sort of does exert a certain form of agency. It's different from human agency, but you know the for me, you get a form of vibrant matter in Lacan. It's the objet petit. It's that is, except it's not divorced from a subject. See, I think what's happening is that we get there's too much of, and maybe this is actually where, even though I'm not a Derridian, I think actually like maybe Derrida can be of use here. You get this split. See, I think that this is what new materialists, whether they realize it or not, or object-oriented ontologists want to do. They're pushing back against the correlationist circle that places, in their view, like a hierarchy. It's a hierarchical relationship between subject and object, or human and thing. And I'm not even necessarily arguing for verticality. I think like to your point about metaphor versus metonymy, it's like for Lacan, the sliding of the signifier is always it's always kind of, it's not necessarily vertical. If you think about sublimation and desublimation, it's like you move from object to object to object when you realize that the object that you had elevated to the dignity of the thing, like, can be desublimated when you find out, well, that's not it. That wasn't the missing piece. That was going to, that was going to fulfill me. But I've always been interested in well, first of all, for Lacan, that object, that vibrant matter is the subject. It's hard to, like, so the point I was going to make about the new materialist and object ontologists is that they want to attack this like binary between subject and object, and actually from the Lacanian position, and this is why I think like Derrida is kind of interesting here, is that it's not a binary relationship. It's an extimate relationship following Lacan, whereas the like subject is different from person. It's, I think actually subjectivity is that which is it's in the human being, but it's in excess of human being, that makes human beings like so weird, I think, or like why humanity is weird. And I've always been, like you said, I'm similar to you. I've always been gravitated toward that. I've been gravitated toward the works of Poe and Melville, because it's not like Captain Ahab from Melville is a perfect example. He seems to fit sort of everything that Jane Bennett and new materialists are against. He has this hubristic fantasy of mastery over nature, including, getting even with Moby Dick. He's sort of all will. The narrator at one point says refers to him as the unsurrenderably willful Ahab, and so he does fit that notion of the ego, of the autonomous, like, bourgeois self, who wants to place himself on par with, God, essentially. So there is that. But if you read the novel closely, you'll see that he says at times like that he doesn't want to go about doing this. Like, if he had his druthers, he would rather actually like go home to his wife and child. But he says, what is it that's in me? What, like, inscrutable, nameless agency? I don't think the term is actually agency, but what is it? What object is it in me that is jamming me on and pushing me to follow Moby Dick? So that it's not Ahab that really is in control. It's, or at least not Ahab as ego. It's this extimate foreign entity or foreign agency that I think for psychoanalysis is the name that psychoanalysis gives it, is subjectivity. And so I think that my answer to the question, if we pose it as a question, like, why is human being, or why are humans so weird, or what makes humanity weird? I think that the answer is subjectivity, but subjectivity understood as this sort of unconscious extimate agency that drives, literally in the Freudian sense, that drives human being and sort of rides it off the rails beyond things like, and I think maybe that's that to your point about the like with regard to where this would fit in and negativity with the university. It's all about sort of like, rational argumentation, what's in your best interest, right? So it would be in your best interest, as you're working on all these, at the end of the semester, to practice self-care. So go to a meditation, an hour or 2 hour faculty or student meditation thing. But what is it that drives us to act against our own self-interest? And it doesn't necessarily have to be purely sort of self-destructive. I mean, the ethics of psychoanalysis, according to the ethics of psychoanalysis, which is a deontological ethics, you can do something because you think it's right. In fact, you should do something because it's the good or the right thing to do, even though it will end in your self-destruction. So I think that's a good, those examples, and I think the literary examples in like Poe and Melville are perfect, are like perfectly exemplify this split between self understood as ego, conscious, self-interest, not just self-autonomous, but self-interested, like self, preservatory. Whereas like in Poe, it's the opposite. It's an imp of the perverse that is constantly goading the subject into, or constantly, let's put it this way, the imp of the perverse is an agent of subjectivity that is constantly pushing the self to act against itself in the rational sort of more, I don't know, utilitarian sense of the term. I don't know, maybe I'm just rambling now.
No, no, no. I think that like what was immediately coming to my mind when you were talking specifically about the character of Melville and sort of going on like, what is it in me that what is it in me that's jamming me on and pushing me to follow Moby Dick? It reminded me of when Lacan saying the object A doesn't leave you in peace, or could we say that could it say that it doesn't, something about it not being a peaceful object, or could we say it doesn't leave you in peace? So it's
No.
just this almost like torturous sort of
Yeah.
almost this torturous drive.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Ahab's case, the objet A doesn't leave you in peace; it leaves leaves you in pieces at the end. I mean, literally, it brings him to his death, and that's a form. It's a. I mean, that's literally in Moby Dick, you get a version of death drive before the fact. Same with Poe and his notion of perversity. It's not this like will to annihilation that the death drive often gets described as this sort of desire to, I don't know, throw yourself headlong into an abyss, which is one of the examples Poe gives of perverseness. It's it's pure it's purely negative. It's I mean, Poe even says when he's defining perverseness, it's antagonistical. And so, well, this is why I think Lacan says this. I know Zizek says it at one point. I think he's getting it from Lacan. But objet A can be an object of both love and of hate. And in the case of Ahab and Moby Dick, it's, I mean, it's hate. I mean, he literally says, from hell's heart, I stab at thee. But what he's ultimately stabbing at, in sort of stabbing at Moby Dick, is that which is in him that is more than him. That is sort of subjectivity. And so subjectivity is this kind of plague, in a way, and it's what upsets human being. I think this is the whole point about psychoanalysis, or one of its main points, is that things seem less baffling or inexplicable if you think about an agency that works to undermine itself, or doesn't work to sort of rational ends. That's not to say that it's entirely irrational. Drive can have its own sort of reason, but it's just trying to get you to it's constantly circling the same sort of the same loss, because that's what, I mean, Drive gets pleasure out of just repeating the loss through the lore that is desire. But I'm trying to think of yeah, let me just pause there because I don't want to get too far afield.
Well, I was just gonna say also in regards to not only like the great connection there you're making with Melville, also the great connection there with Poe and the imp of the perverse is like when you're emphasizing this act against itself in terms of the act against sort of a rational self-interest. It seems to me like, especially with framing this in relationship to the subject and the real, or the object patia, that it seems like some relationship to truth is at stake here. and a very strange relationship to truth, like a form of, and here thinking about different sort of like basically thinking about the cause of the subject as truth, and it being some sort of um, difficulty for us to language, or difficult for us to think about, at least in the level of the ego and sort of rational normative discourse. Not sure what you think about that, but I was like playing in my head with this idea that on the side of the cultural historicists, you have sort of like a reduction of the subject to social discourse. On the side of the new materialists, you have sort of a reduction of the subject potentially to like biological need or biological instincts. And then sort of what the subject of the unconscious is kind of more this sort of chaotic drive in a void, like in between nature and culture. But
Yeah,
like there's a way in which there's a third way here.
yeah, but the notion of truth is interesting because um so to speak about it less in the sort of thinkers like Melville and Poe, the sort of perverseness of their characters has often been read epistemologically, in that what's ultimately going on is that these characters are on a quest for a certain sort of absolute knowledge, which in a way you could read as a sort of definitive truth. Um, and they always, not always, but most of the time, like so according to that reading, it would be that, well, the pursuit of truth or the quest for truth is what ultimately ends up killing them. But if you read it more sort of ontologically, as an attempt to sort of answer that the question of like que voy, of what is it that makes human beings sort of that runs it off the rails through drive, a fascination with a lethal thing. Truth, I think, in this sense, the truth would be, or the relation between subjectivity and truth is, let's take the character of Antigone. Antigone would not be true, to herself if she didn't follow her own law, right? I mean, it's not, the way the play is typically thought of is you have, God's law or the law of the gods, and then you've got human law. It doesn't really have to do with that. It's that Antigone is confronted with the sort of moral law to do her duty, regardless of whatever the outcome is, whether it's death or not. And so it's not so much, again, like the epistemological approach will then view it as a sort of quest to obtain truth. Whereas I think that with respect to like a character like Antigone, you see that it's about, and it's not the simplistic sort of like, mantra today that you hear, like, live your truth, be yourself, which is about self-actualization. This is about truth in Antigone's sense. And I think that this has to do with the Lacanian theory of the act, like capital A more broadly, is maintaining your fidelity to a truth that means more to you than sort of anything else. So you will not compromise on your desire to go back to, it's the ethics. Antigone is Seminar 7, so it's the ethics of psychoanalysis. Regardless of what happened, and here you see again the division between, and this is where the negativity comes in again, the division between self and subjectivity, because truth is on the level of subjectivity, it's not at the level of self. And so it's remaining true to that choice and going through with the act, even if, and what is morally true, what the moral law tells you, or what you divine the moral law to be, again, regardless of the consequences, regardless of if you end up, entombed alive, like Antigone is. And so it is much more about, it gets almost religious or spiritual in a way, but like, Zizek will say this about maintaining your fidelity to the act, or to the truth. I think this is another way of, um, articulating Lacan's point that psychoanalysis is a kind of truth procedure in a way.
I love that. I mean, I always try to bring it back to sort of my own relationship to these things, but I was thinking about when I first stumbled into this field, I feel like what's been at stake in sort of continuing this drive is a certain maintaining fidelity to the act, like in this,
Yeah,
irrespective of the consequences. Like I'm gonna study this even if it ruins my career, or I'm gonna study this even if it, you know what
right.
I mean. Like, but I think that there's something in that drive which I think is, it's interesting to juxtapose against what you were saying about the modern university being sort of more geared towards careerist pursuits,
Right,
is that it
right.
doesn't contain the space for the act. It doesn't.
Yeah,
And
well,
then my question would be, can it contain the space for the act, or is that an impossible thing to demand,
I don't think I really don't think so. I mean, I think that we'd have to rethink what the role of the university is, at least as it's currently framed. I mean, I'll give you an example. And again, I say this. I mean, I'm the you mentioned at the outset. I'm the director currently of our literature major for undergraduates. And so every year we have an event, and I think it's a successful event. I think it's a necessary event the way that the university is system is structured, but it's titled "What You Can Do with an English Major," and it's meant, I think, in a lot of ways. Well, first of all, to inform students as to the various different career paths that they can take, or the jobs that they can go into with a degree in English literature. That's part of it. Another one is you have something that you can go back to your parents and tell them, mom, dad, it's okay to be an English major. Like, I won't starve. I can get a job, editing, or, working in advertising or things like that. And so, um, you know, I don't think necessarily that the university right now is a place, where you can go and freely tell students, or that it would be a good idea to go and tell students, like, go home, like I was saying earlier, go home and tarry with the negative, and remain, keep remain faithful to that sort of drive that you have. Now, we encourage students to do it all the time in a different way. Like, okay, your parents are telling you that you need to be, your parents really want you to go into medicine and to become a doctor, but your passion clearly is English or philosophy or history. And then, we'll encourage the student, well, okay, maybe you can do this and then take a minor in English or a minor in philosophy. But the space to treat, so to anyway wait, I don't want to get lost. To go back to the what to do with an English major event, I think that we have to do that, because there is something about the credentialing that you get when you leave a university, university, to go out into the workforce. But the whole point of a liberal arts education is not so that at the end of the 4 years you can go out and get a job and serve capital, depending upon where you work, or what profession you go into. But yeah, that's not why I went into it, because I wanted to be. I saw, frankly, like, I saw the reason why I went to grad school for literature is because I knew almost right away, when I was a freshman in college, I had a professor who was teaching the Charlotte Perkins Gilman short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. And at the end of that story, the narrator of it, who is a woman who's been subjected to the rest cure, she's like locked in a nursery basically for I don't know, months, weeks, months on end. She ends up going insane because of it, and she's like crawling on the floor. And that professor, like, literally acted that out and started crawling on the floor. And he was so passionate about it that I was like, this is what I want to do. it didn't even occur to me, to think, well, what's, how many years do I have to go to school to do this? Will there be a job at the end of it? That wasn't why I was invested in it, even if I wanted at the end of it to be a
Utilitarian.
professor. Yeah. So I really think that it goes back to our point about the sort of vocationalization, I guess, of the university system, so that even in the liberal arts, I mean, there was a big article in, was it Chronicle of Higher Education, or was it New York Times, about, it's constantly being debated, like, are the death of the humanities, are the humanities dead? And so you have people who, are trying to continually justify it. Well, no, look at, these are the jobs you can get from humanities degree, as opposed to like, this is the education you can get, or this is the kind of, growth that you can get just as a human being, as a thinker, as a result of taking courses in philosophy or in English literature or literary or critical theory. It is, so I think the way the university system is set up now, it's designed to be entirely, utilitarian, and that's not to say that you can't pursue it. I have students who pursue, it for the love of it, for its own sake. We're back to like deontology now. It's like, good, like, do the good act for good sake. Don't, very few people would go into becoming an English major because, at the end of it, you're guaranteed a job with a Fortune 500 company or something like that, right? Same with philosophy, the field of philosophy. So, yeah, I really don't see the university. I think you can foster it, but as far as like to go back to your question about the act, I think it would be quite dangerous, or considered, quite dangerous to bring this in a classroom context.
Yeah, it seems to me it breaks the entire paradigm. And in that regard, when you're talking about the death of the humanities, it kind of reminded me of like the way we might think about like death of God theology. Like it's constantly debated, like, is God dead?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
God not dead? And then it like
yeah,
reminded me of Alenka Zupancic statement where she says, God is dead and I'm not feeling too well either. So it's like this,
yeah,
so it's like this,
yeah,
like the death of
yep,
the humanities could be situated in this regards. And I wonder,
yeah,
like, I'm just also thinking about, in the Écrit, Lacan sort of, expands upon Freud's ideal sort of department, and he has certain disciplines that he would, structure his department with. And it's like, I
yeah,
wonder if, like, in an era where we're talking a lot about post-humanism, or we're talking about transhumanism, I was wondering if there's a different signifier. I wonder if there's like, a department of the unconscious, or like a department of the subject of the unconscious, or like, does that make any sense? Like, are we beyond sort of human? Like, is basically my
yeah.
question would be, is the death of the individual monad, ego, and so rational subject and so forth? Are we dealing with a transition of the order of a subject of the unconscious moving beyond the humanities?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I would call it, I would call it inhuman studies in a way, because I think that that's really the key. I mean, I think that that's the
Let's
way that
start
you
it.
phrase
Let's start it.
the way that you phrase. I know. Oh, yeah, let's do it. The way that you phrase the question actually, and pose that question, actually sort of articulated something for me that I haven't been able to necessarily articulate yet, which is that, subjectivity is, it's the kernel of the inhuman, or what's in excess of the human, within human being itself. And so, you know as much as, um you know there, critics or theorists will go on about the death of the individual, or of the ego, we are in an era where I don't think that the actual, like, ego has been more sort of massaged, or has been more sort of foregrounded. Again, where it's back to, like, be yourself, maximize, your truest potential. Um, don't let anyone naysay you. Again, just be in the moment. A good friend of mine, Anna Kornblue, just finished a book that's going to be coming out from Verso next month titled Immediacy, where she gets into this sort of in some ways. I mean, we haven't had a larger cult of the self than we have now, but that, I think, helps to articulate the difference that psychoanalysis makes, because it is the sort of this kernel of like the inhuman within human. So it would still be grounded in a sort of humanistic approach, but that dimension of inhumanity, where and that's why I think that the act is always, at least psychoanalytically understood, is always it can't be differentiated before the fact from something like diabolical evil, right? Both Zizek and Alenka Zupancic argue, they make this point. I think Alenka is extremely good on it in her first book, Ethics of the Real, that in the Kantian schema, or the idealist schema more generally, like the highest good is formally indistinguishable from diabolical evil, because it's entirely contentless. It's just do your duty for duty's sake. I think Zizek covers this really well in his book, The Indivisible Remainder. And so it's that, I think, the unconscious, if we were to start a department of like dedicated to subjectivity or the unconscious, I would say like, we've got it would be the school of inhumanities.
Yes, I love that term. I think in the field of signifiers, where you have the post-human, the transhuman, I think we need to make space for the inhuman studies, and I think that's maybe we're onto something with that one. But
because I think no, I was just going to say, because I think that again, it's not that Lacan is entirely. There's actually a really interesting collection, an edited book. I think it's on Lacan and the post-human, and or transhuman. It's not that these are entirely divorced. Another friend of mine, Matthew Flisfader, is working on questions of humanism and its relation to like post-humanism, transhumanism. But yeah, I really do think like inhumanism is we need to develop that strain of thought more. Let's do it.
Yeah, I'm honestly game. But back to subject lessons to make sure we cover all of our ground. I do have a question about the proliferation of signifiers in regards to, let's say, the quote unquote enemy or other of what you guys propose as the future of materialism in a Freudo-Lacanian and Hegelian lens. Is like there's a number of different schools here, and I want to differentiate, but I don't want to just lump them into one category. I want to sort of like pull apart what's different about these different. So like there's new materialism, there's object-oriented ontology, there's speculative realism, and I think there's one or two others. So I was wondering if you could go into, what brings all of these categories into a group for you, and then what maybe where do they differ internally, and it may be in relation to each other, and whether or not you align with one particular strand that you think has more promise than another, let's say.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So, and in fact, if people are interested, we had Graham Harman and I had a little bit of a debate or a back and forth about this. We actually did have a debate, but unfortunately, we didn't record the Zoom, so we didn't have video of it. That was about over 2 years ago now. But we did have a debate in print about this, because one of the things that so when Subject Lessons, after it was published, Graham Harman wrote a long, it wasn't so much maybe it was a review essay, but it was mostly critical. He did have some positive things to say. And Harman, we have debates, but he and I were on speaking we're on friendly terms. Slavoj is friendly with him as well. But one of the things that he accused us of, and I think actually to a certain degree, like rightfully so, was of collapsing the differences between things like new materialism, object-oriented ontology, speculative realism, actor network theory. These are not all the same. There are important differences between them. And for instance, what book is it of his? If people are interested in reading more about this, I then so Harman's piece, his review was in a journal. I think he is one of the editors, or maybe the general editor, Open Philosophy. And then he very kindly invited me to respond, to write a response to him. And so in that response, that's also in Open Philosophy, and I think it's titled. It's a piece of mine now. I'm forgetting it. Like notes toward a. What is it called? It's like notes toward a. I'm going to forget what it is. It's an Open Philosophy. I'll look it up in a second. But it's a response where I basically agree and then disagree with Harman at the same time. So Harman has a book, I think it's his book Immaterialism, where he has a list of all the differences between, as far as he's concerned, between new materialism and object-oriented ontology. Now, speculative realism is pretty much defunct. Speculative realism was around a group that involved, I'm going to forget some of the people, but it was Graham Harman, Levi Bryant, Ray Brassier.
Was it Quentin Mayasu?
Mayasu. Was Ian Hamilton Grant involved with that as well? Mayasu, but those were the main four. And they've since moved away from that now. Quentin Mayasu considers himself, he'll say, a speculative materialist. Brassier had a falling out with Harman. He's completely separate from that group now. And Levi Bryant and Harman both went on to become object-oriented ontologists, although even their object-oriented ontology is different. Here's where they all overlap, I would argue. And I think that this is correct. They all overlap in so far as they participate in this very flattening that you were talking about earlier, like during that you experienced in your, when you were in graduate school, is that it is all about horizontalizing the ontological plane. And so they share that notion of a flat ontology. Now, Harman, like object-oriented ontology, is different in that he focuses on like the withdrawal of what he calls the withdrawal of objects, or their smoldering volcanic core, and that goes further than the new materialists do. Harman isn't so much interested, it seems to me, in ecology at all. His version of object-oriented ontology, whereas somebody like Levi Bryant's is. Actor network theory is different in that but they all share also the idea that agency gets sort of spread out, is also horizontalized. Their differences, to be honest, I'd have to. It's been a while since I went back and did a deep dive on this. I know what the I don't know if it's the subtitle, but I just remembered the title of my response to Harman. It's titled Notes Toward an Extimate Materialism. That's the subtitle, or that's either the title or the subtitle. But in there, I kind of respond and I develop this this at greater length, where I differentiate a bit between them and say, yes, Harman is right that it's not quite correct to fold them all together. There are differences between them that are important, even if some of them are escaping me right now. But but there's no doubt that they share that commitment to horizontality, to flat ontology. And it's not so much that Lacan, or like the Lacano-Hegelian position, is no verticality over horizontality, as in like as it is that doesn't horizontalizing the ontological plane does not get rid of subjectivity, because subjectivity is actually, I think Alenka argues this, it's actually the rift in ontology. It's actually the rift in the ontological plane, as opposed to being on the same level as it. It's almost like a meta concern, or a meta concept.
Well, I was actually gonna use this as an opportunity to bring up a concept that I've played with myself, and I absolutely love in Alenka's work, and you bring it up as well in the beginning, is object disoriented ontology, as
Oh
I
yeah,
think really fascinating play on the term. And of course, the disorientation, as you state in the introduction, is the object patia. So maybe we could
yeah.
get a little bit of your positive program here in terms of what is object A ontology, which is, connected to what Alenka is doing with object disoriented ontology.
Yeah, so that's, I think, so it goes back to the point that I was making earlier, I think, about it's related to this notion of inhumanism, or of subjectivity as that which is in excess. So, for instance, let me give you an example, and this is in the that piece I was talking about, the Notes Toward an Extant Materialism. Harman has he looks at, it's seminar 11 with the sardine can, and Lacan's theory of the gaze. And there's that if you remember that the anecdote where there's the sardine can floating and sort of like gleaming on the water, and somebody asks him, like, do you see that sardine can? Well, it doesn't see you. And Harman interprets that scene as sardine can is objet petit a, and the person, let's say it's Lacan, viewing the sardine can, is the subject, the phenomenological, like, viewer who's experiencing that. But that's not what Lacan means to say. There are actually two and a half maybe like entities at work there. There's the viewer, but subjectivity, like the subject, is that which is looking back at you. So in that case, the sardine can would be split between like object and subject, because objet petit a is always a manifestation of subjectivity, in like, it's a materialization of it. And so that's a manifestation of the real, when the person is confronted with their subjectivity returned to them in the form of the gaze. That's why Lacan's notion of gaze is so different from that which was developed, even though she was a Lacanian theorist, by Laura Mulvey, in the notion of the male gaze, because then you have, that's all about the spectator and looking. But the gaze is for Lacan is the object, the objet, which is the subject, looking back at you, and you're confronted with that gap between who you are viewing it, and that extimate kernel of your subjectivity staring back at you. And so that is what, to go back to your point about Zupančič, that is what disorients being. And that is what renders, that's why I think it's related to, that's why I say subjectivity is this kind of like disease, or is this kind of malady that develops a sort of inhumanism within the human, because that is literally, if we're talking about ontology, what disrupts human being and which renders human being, again, like driven, without a sort of home, like out of place in the great chain of being, in a way, because it's a being that is in excess of itself. And so I think that in her book What is Sex, which I know you've studied and taught, that it's the objet a is an object. It's not like other objects. It's an exceptional object, but not in the sense of like subjectivity being human exceptionalism. Oh, look at how much more grandiose and how much more agency and power humans have over the. It's what plagues humanity, what plagues human being. And she says that it's what the objet a, its emergence, is what curves or biases or twists the level of being, so that it is a disorienting. So it wouldn't speak the notion of an object oriented that's what an object A ontology would be. Object A ontology would be the ontology of inhumanism. To try to tie that in, and that's different from orienting ontology around a completely flat field or flat plane where human being is on the same level of being as an object, because objects, unless they're, they don't have that sort of sublime, disorienting characteristic that the objet a as a particular subjective form of vibrant matter has.
It's
Does that make
almost like
sense?
no, not only does it make sense, I think it's incredibly important. I think that like where I am with these ideas is just how can we put these ideas to work? And maybe that's why there needs to be some sort of department or field of study organized, some sort of organization around these ideas. Because it
Yeah.
seems to me like there's a lot of application to them, like in terms of, even like studying the way you were talking about the gaze in relationship to contemporary specular capture online, or marketing and
Yeah.
advertising and contemporary capitalism, or like even like the formation of ego ideals and ideal egos and stuff like that. Like it seems to me like this is a very rich field for discussion.
Yeah. And I think even more so, like even more now than against the sort of ego psychologist that Lacan was combating. I think we're still under the regime of like of ego psychology in a way, because if you think about it, um within the discourse of, like, say, the modern university, it would be hard to imagine, like, let's say psychoanalysis like was no longer a sort of treated as a pseudoscience that has been debunked and that we're beyond it. If it were to be incorporated like regularly in the university, let's say like Department of Psychoanalysis, it would almost certainly, I'm not saying academics would necessarily, that this would be their main focus, although for some of them, but it would almost necessarily be incorporated as a sort of therapeutic practice that could also be sort of it could turn into self-care again. Well, we need a department of psychoanalysis so that our students and faculty, or students can learn, you know how to take care of their mental health better, as opposed to like the big philosophical ontological questions that, like, for us, like, I don't know, a center for inhumanism would be interested in developing, or would be interested in tracing. And so there are pockets of, there are a number of academics within the university who are working in this. One really good sort of institution, or not institution, it's not but an organization, would be that which, along with his wife Hillary Neroni and his also the other organizers, Jennifer Friedlander and Henry Cripps, that Todd McGowan organizes and runs the LAC organization, and that brings together. Those conferences are great because those bring together academics. There are some non academics who go and present, but by and large, it's academics from fields like there's English, there's philosophy, there's political theory, there's film studies, economics, and so people are doing the work. You were talking earlier about there being, excitement and energy around this online, sort of para or outside of the university, but there is I think a growing sense within the university and a growing group of scholars and academics within the university who are working on these things. And even if we don't have much sort of like institutional not support, but like institutional strength, like amongst the group, it's very closely knit, and people who are committed to doing this work, no matter how sort of weird or outside of the bounds of what everyone else in their departments are working on, works on. So
Well, that's promising, and unfortunately, I never had a chance to attend one of the Philosophy of Lack conference series. But I guess one of my like final or concluding questions would be, what do you think that as far as I'm aware, because I am in the sort of mailing list for that, is that it's coming to an end, but it's going to be transformed into something else, and what might that something else look like? Will it still be called the LAC conference, or is it going to be retitled, renamed, rebranded?
well, I think it has more to do with Todd swearing that he doesn't want to organize another another conference by like himself again. But no, I don't think it's coming to an end. If it is, or if he said it is, I think like reports of its demise are greatly exaggerated. I think that it's so far it's been happening with the exception of the pandemic, although it wasn't around much longer than that. I think we had there were two conferences before the pandemic, and it was, I think, every other year. And so I'm not sure where the next one is going to be held. The last one, you should definitely come to the next one, if you can. I'm not sure where it's going to be. The last one was in Vermont, and that's where Todd is located, in the University of Vermont. So I know it's not going to be there again, but I do think that it's going to still exist. And there's the mailing list. There's the website that Matt Flisfeder and he's been doing more work on it than I have. But we had a couple interviews on there, and there were a few blog posts. So maybe we need to ramp that up a little bit. But because that's about as close as we have, as far as I'm concerned, like within the institution. It's now every meeting has been in the US so far. The first two were at Colorado College. Alenka was a keynote. Joan Kupchak was a keynote. Slavoj was a keynote. Mladen Dolar gave a keynote address. So it has all of our usual suspects involved. Adrian was at one of the conferences, Adrian Johnston. So I think that is the most significant, like within the university, at least in like Anglo-American world that I'm aware of. And I just hope it develops. So I don't think it's ending. If anything, I think it's going to expand, hopefully.
Fantastic. I mean, any way I can get involved, any way I can help with that, I certainly will. And maybe
It'd be
even
great.
brainstorming. I'd always be open to brainstorming possibilities of bringing it to Europe. That might be possible as well. So hey, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But I guess on a final note for subject lessons, I think you guys end on the future of materialism and sort of at least in the introduction, and sort of setting the stage for, of course, all of the authors who have contributed to subject lessons. Where are you now in your work with the idea of materialism, and maybe connected to the potential future organizing of LAC conference? What do you see as some of the main orientation points in your work?
Yeah, well, so, you know, it's it's interesting because when so publishing that book and having edited it with Slavoj was was a big deal because he's such a big name that um to be associated with him, I got a number of requests afterwards, to contribute to issues. And there's only, there's only so much that that you can do. And I think that as far as the framing things or using like new materialism or flat ontology, to use the more, maybe more accurate general term for this constellation of different sort of schools of thought, um I think like responding to that, I've sort of moved beyond because I think I've said pretty much everything that I have to say, even like debating Graham Harman or new materialism. I think that my work has moved away from that, but I've been working on uh finishing up a book for the short circuit series on Melville and Lacan. This is why I kept reverting to Melville examples, I think. But I've been interested in and actually in subject lessons, my chapter, my standalone chapter at the end of the book, um, from sublimity to sublimation, Melville or Hegel, Melville, Lacan, is it's part of one of the chapters on Moby Dick that's going to be in that Melville and Lacan book. And that's still, so I'm still very interested in materialism. So for instance, the Moby Dick chapter is all about how like objet A as a form of vibrant matter that is tied to the subject, and its emergence ends up running Ahab, to his death. I talk about Melville's novel, after the one that he wrote after Moby Dick, Pierre, and how that is a very Kantian novel because it's all about ethics. So it's also Lacanian in that regard. So I'm drawing a lot upon Alenka Zupanch's work in that chapter. But um, uh, how psychoanalytic ethics is also a materialist ethics. And so I basically, through Melville, I treat materialism um, at the level of sort of aesthetics, ethics, and politics. So that's what I've been working on. But really, my focus has been less on explicitly couching it or framing it as a form of Lacanian materialism, even though that's what it is. And I've just been delving more into things we were talking about a little bit earlier in our discussion about how literature thinks um, how literature thinks in this like sort of Lacanian materialist manner, especially the American Romantic tradition. So that's where a lot of my work has been going. So it is still, and Melville, I think I mentioned this earlier, Melville studies is still very much, or over the past 10 years has gone, like if you're going to see the impact of flat ontology and vitalism and new materialism and object-oriented ontology in American literary studies, at least pre-20th century, you're going to see it in Melville studies. I think the critic Branka Arsic has a book coming out on Melville and new materialism that shifts the focus from the human characters in Melville to, Melville's obsession with creatures of the sea. And so that's really putting into practice what sort of Jane Bennett, is arguing for. So in that regard, my work is still in dialogue with that and sort of pushing back against it. From this brand of like Lacano-Hegelian materialism, but couched less explicitly, like this is my response or our response to these different fields. And now it's more just like the point has been made, I think. And now it's like I felt like I had to engage that work more to justify what I'm doing. And now it's like, okay, that argument has been made. Now let's get to the work of having gotten the debate out of the way. Let's get to work as to what this Lacanian materialism is.
Fantastic. I think that's a perfect way to go about it. I think that, once sort of the cultural tension's been exhausted, it's about sort of asserting sort of the future direction of this perspective, of this orientation. So I think that's fantastic, and it's really good to know that there's going to be an expansion of what was going on at the philosophy of lack, as opposed to a subtraction or an ending to it. So maybe lots of orientation points and touch points in the future. And certainly
Yeah.
when your book comes out, of a gainful loss, fantastic title. Maybe we'll have a chance to have another conversation, because I'd love to pick that up and reflect on it. Um,
Oh,
well,
I would love to come back. Yeah.
well, Russell, it's been fantastic. I guess the last thing I'll say to the viewers from my side is just that there'll be links in the descriptions to subject lessons. It's like I sort of stated in the outset, it's a book which is focusing on this objectal turn in the humanities, and it states in the book description there, and emphasizing this indispensability of the subject. It was edited by yourself and Zizek, and has several contributions from figures like Mladen Dollar, Alenka Zupancic, Adrian Johnston, Todd McGowan, and many others. So I highly suggest people to check that book out. I think it does sort of represent an important engagement with a form of metaphysical thought, which is dominant in, or even hegemonic in, the contemporary universities. So there's a lot of work yet to be done, but I'll leave the final word to you. If there's something that you would like to leave the viewers with, either in relationship to your past work or your ongoing work,
Oh,
feel
well,
free
I
to
no, I
feel
just
free.
want to, yeah, I just want to thanks, I just want to thank you again for having me. Um, the book is going to be a while, not only because I still have to finish it, but also, the whole time it takes, especially with academic presses, to go to press. I would love to come back. In between now and then, though, I may have a couple of shorter pieces. I think I've reached the maximum of what I can publish from the Melville book, but a couple of shorter pieces on Poe, where I develop some of what I was talking about with the imp of the perverse a little bit further, and subjectivity, will hopefully be out within the next, probably the next year or so. And I also have something on for a collection that's going to be, or a special issue of a journal that's going to be published on the 30th anniversary of Joan Kopchek's Read My Desire book, which is next year will be the 30th anniversary. But I'll keep you posted about that. But as far as anything else is concerned, the book is what is the ultimate thing. I would love to come back to talk about that, but that'll be a while. But I'll keep you. I can send you some stuff as I work on it. We should stay in touch.
Absolutely. I'll definitely be interested in that. So everyone who's been listening, this has been myself and Russell Sbriglia talking about subject lessons, and have a great evening. Do you feel like you're living in a wasteland of thought? Philosophy Portal is a thinking community, a thought oasis in a wasteland of thought. Now we're launching a thinking portal, a live event space aiming to facilitate dynamic connections, creating open but contained and focused spaces to test and work with new ideas. Our live event space will feature 4 different events every month, all structured by one theme. Concept Cave to learn fundamental concepts. The Edge to meet active practitioners. Thought Lab to be inspired by core thinkers. And Real Talk, a space for personal relation to these ideas. Members not only get access to our 4 live events monthly, but also access to our private forum, receive discounts on our recorded and live courses, as well as priority access to apply for retreats. Welcome to the Thinking Portal. We hope you join us in 2024.